This is where the American story is said to begin. A harbor, a cold November, a group of exhausted English settlers stepping onto a shore they would call a new world, as though the world itself had only just been made. We have enshrined this moment in bronze and school curricula and national myth. We have given it a date. We have given it a name. But before we examine what arrived in 1620, we must ask a harder question. What had already happened here? Before the Pilgrims, there were people who had lived on this coast for at least 12,000 years, a confederacy of communities, a sophisticated network of villages, fields, fisheries, and trade routes maintained across generations with a precision no English map had yet recorded. And then, in the decade before the Pilgrims arrived, something moved through these communities. Not an army, not a war, something quieter and in many ways more devastating than either. What the Pilgrims inherited was not a wilderness waiting to be claimed. It was a landscape already reshaped by catastrophe, one they did not witness, did not fully cause, and largely did not understand. These are not two different stories about the same land. They are two different understandings of what land is, what catastrophe means, and who is permitted to name what they find. The conventional account of New England's founding rests on a particular kind of logic, not just a map of the land, but a map of what land is for. In this version of history, land is a category of property. It can be empty or occupied, claimed or unclaimed, civilized or wild. When John Smith sailed the New England coast in 1614 and published his map, the one that gave this region its English name, he was doing more than recording geography. He was translating a living landscape into a document of potential. He saw resources. He saw availability. The legal principle behind English settlement had a name, vacuum domicilium, the idea that land not visibly occupied in ways English law recognized could be legally appropriated. Not stolen, appropriated. The language mattered enormously. John Winthrop, who had governed the Massachusetts Bay Colony, wrote that native peoples had not subdued the land and therefore held no legal claim to it. This was not presented as opinion, it was presented as reason, as the natural order of things. From inside that framework, the logic was airtight. If civilization is measured by fences and written deeds, and if property requires formal individual boundaries, then a landscape without those markers could appear, to certain eyes, as an open question awaiting an answer. What that logic could not account for was why the land looked the way it did. The open forests, the cleared fields, the maintained fisheries, these were not accidents of nature. They were the products of thousands of years of deliberate, intelligent management. Every map is an argument. The English maps that preceded settlement argued through their very conventions, their grids, their named capes, their measured harbors, that this land was ready to receive a new kind of order. The order it already had simply did not appear on those maps. And so the invisible was made official, not through one dramatic act, but through accumulation, through documents and surveys and legal proceedings, each one small, collectively transformative. What existed before was not erased, it was rendered illegible. The Wampanoag, whose name means people of the first light, were not a single village or tribe in the way those words are often used. They were a confederacy, a network of distinct communities sharing language, kinship, ceremony, and a profound understanding of the landscape they had cultivated across millennia. Their relationship to land did not require fences because it did not rest on exclusion, it rested on responsibility. Communities held rights to particular places, to fish certain weirs, to plant certain fields, but these rights were communal, inherited, and governed not by written deed, but by memory, ceremony, and reciprocal obligation. The forests early European explorers described as almost park-like, open, easy to move through, full of game, were not accidents. They were the result of thousands of years of controlled burning, managed harvesting, and deliberate planting. The land looked the way it did because people had tended it with extraordinary care. The movement between winter inland camps and summer coastal villages was not wandering, It was rotation, a practice that allowed both the land and the community to regenerate. The Wampanoag understood seasonal cycles with a precision that structured the entire calendar of their lives. Sachem Massasoit governed not through written law, but through a web of alliances, obligations, and ceremonial relationships that held dozens of communities in balance across the region. This was not a simpler system than what the English brought. It was a different one, older, more ecologically integrated, and complex in its own terms. The Wampanoag recorded agreements not in written deeds, but in wampum, beaded belts whose patterns encoded the terms of a relationship. To the English, this was no record at all. To the Wampanoag, it was a living document, one that both parties were expected to remember and honor. This was a coherent world, not a world waiting to be organized, but a world already organized, on its own terms, through its own logic, in relationship with its own land. It simply did not look like what the English recognized as civilization, and that failure of recognition would cost everything. The story that changes everything did not begin in 1620, it began 4 years earlier. And it began not with ships or soldiers, but with something invisible, moving through communities that had no defense against it. Between 1616 and 1619, a catastrophic epidemic swept through the coastal nations of southern New England. Scholars have debated its precise nature. Leptospirosis, hepatitis, typhus, and plague-like infections have all been proposed. What is not debated is its scale. It was unlike anything these communities had encountered in living memory. European ships had been working the New England coast for decades before 1620, fishing, trading, occasionally capturing people for sale as enslaved servants in Europe. These contacts left no permanent settlements, but they left something else. Diseases that moved through populations with no immunity far faster than any ship could sail. In 1619, English explorer Thomas Dermer sailed the same coast the Pilgrims would reach 1 year later. He wrote to his patron, "I passed along the coast, where I found some ancient plantations, not long since populous, now utterly void." Utterly void. The fields were still there, the cleared ground was still there, the people were gone. Edward Winslow, one of the Plymouth colonists, later described what he found on the Cape. The bones and skulls of the dead lay upon the ground where their houses had been, a very sad spectacle. He recorded this not with horror, but with a kind of solemn wonder. What he could not yet understand was what he was actually walking through. Some estimates suggest that between 70 and 90% of the coastal Wampanoag and Massachusetts populations died in those 3 years. Entire villages ceased to exist. Cleared fields returned to grass. Weirs stood unmaintained. The trails connecting communities grew silent. The loss was not human. It was the loss of the knowledge those people carried. When the Pilgrims explored Cape Cod in November 2020, they found stores of corn buried by hands that had not survived to retrieve them. They took it. They recorded in their own journals a moment of hesitation, uncertainty about whether this was right. Then they took it. It would help them survive their first winter. The site the Pilgrims chose for their settlement was not empty land. It was Patuxet, a Wampanoag village whose entire population had been erased by the epidemic. The cleared fields they found, the ground already broken for planting, these were not gifts of providence. They were the remains of a community that no longer had anyone left to tend them. The Pilgrims interpreted what they found as provision, as evidence that God had prepared this place for them. What they were actually standing in was a graveyard. These were not two different interpretations of the same facts. They were two entirely different systems for understanding what facts mean. The displacement of one knowledge system by another rarely happens at once. In New England, it happened through deeds, through transactions that each party understood differently. The Sachems understood themselves to be granting use rights, as they had always done among themselves. The English understood themselves to be purchasing permanent, exclusive property. The same moment, two incompatible meanings. Surveying followed. Each survey made the English claim more permanent and the Indigenous one more invisible. The land was not being conquered in these surveys, it was being administered.
converted, deed by deed and boundary line by boundary line, into a legal reality that had no room for the system it was replacing. When Metacom, whom the English called King Philip, sachem of the Wampanoag, led a coordinated resistance in 1675, his people understood it as a defense of a coherent way of life. When the English defeated that resistance in 1676, they understood it as the suppression of savagery. What actually ended was a worldview's ability to operate freely on its own land. The praying towns, settlements where surviving native people were confined, converted, and subjected to English law and religious instruction, were not simply brutal, they were administrative. They were the mechanism by which one system of relationship to land was replaced, legally
and physically, by another. Systematically, documented, orderly. Language followed. Schooling followed. Indigenous language was removed from legal proceedings, which meant that the system for governing land could no longer be accessed in the terms in which the land had always been understood. The administration of erasure required no single dramatic decree, it required only consistency. Each step was logical within its own system. Each step closed a door on the one before it. What was built was not only a colony, it was an entire administrative reality, one that made the older system invisible not by destroying it entirely, but by making it legally unrecognizable. What was lost is not easily inventoried. There is the ecological knowledge, thousands of years of understanding of how these specific watersheds, these specific fisheries, these specific forests operated as living systems. Much of it was carried in the minds of people who did not survive. When a people is reduced by 90%, it is not only lives that disappear, it is libraries. Massachusetts, the Algonquian language of the coastal nations, was brought to near extinction. Languages do not only carry words, they carry categories, the distinctions a community draws in the world that no other language draws in quite the same way. When the language nearly died, those distinctions nearly went with it. The Wampanoag language is being revitalized. Jessie Littledoe Baird, linguist and Mashpee Wampanoag tribal citizen, has led a decades-long effort to restore Massachusetts to living use. She has described the work's origin, recurring dreams in which her ancestors spoke to her in a language she did not yet know. She decided to learn it. The Wampanoag were not erased. They were pressed, hard, and for a very long time, but they did not disappear. The Wampanoag tribe of Gayhead Aquina on Martha's Vineyard maintained continuous community and cultural life through centuries of legal invisibility. Ceremony continued, kinship continued. The relationship to the land continued, even when no law recognized it. Some things survived not in institutions, but in people, not in records, but in memory, not loudly, quietly, which is sometimes the only way survival is possible when the system surrounding you has decided you no longer exist. In 2020, exactly 400 years after the Mayflower, the federal government moved to disestablish the Mashpee Wampanoag Reservation, challenging the tribe's eligibility to hold land in trust. The case was eventually resolved in the tribe's favor, but the fact that it required resolution at all tells us something important. The two systems did not finish their argument in the 17th century. They are still arguing now. The modern legal system still governs land through property, title, and the administrative state, the direct inheritance of the colonial structures that displaced the older system. The Wampanoag still understand land through frameworks of relationship and responsibility, frameworks forced into courtrooms in English legal language in order to be heard, but never fully extinguished. These two systems do not resolve into each other neatly. They negotiate. Return for a moment to that harbor, to the morning the Mayflower anchored off Cape Cod, and the passengers looked out at a shoreline that seemed to them quiet and open, and perhaps even prepared. They were not wrong that it was quiet. What they could not read was the nature of that quietness. They did not know they were standing in the silence left by catastrophe. They did not know that the cleared fields were gardens whose farmers had died. What happened in New England before 1620 was not a prelude to the American story. It was a story in itself, complete, coherent, and catastrophically interrupted. The land the Pilgrims found was not empty, it was in mourning. The question is not whether that matters. The question is whether we are willing to sit with the discomfort of learning what it means. This is Before America, a channel for people who believe that understanding where we are requires understanding everything that came before. If that question stays with you, stay with us. There is much more to learn.